Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me today for this presentation. Today, I will present some EEG evidence during a body representation task in humans with spinal cord injury. I will focus particularly on two measurements, event-related potentials and spectral perturbations. So to start, I would like to introduce the concept of body representation. Body representation is a multidimensional concept because in order to maintain a current body representation, we need to integrate a multiple sensory input. So we need to have an intact multisensory integration. So an intact perception through our senses, as well as we need to integrate proprioceptive, interoceptive, and vestibular inputs. But also some stored representations of our body from the memory. So we also need to have an intermental construct of the body. To study body representation, it has been divided in two main components, the body schema and the body image. So now they are divided in because it's a way that can be studied in laboratory setting, but it's important that you know that one cannot exist without another. So they kind of co-construct each other. So the body schema is a more plastic sensorimotor representation of the body and is essential for action. And in order to activate the body schema, we need to simulate a movement. For example, in the picture that we have here, if I ask you to tell me if this is a left or right hand, you need to internally simulate to perform the same movement in order to bring this hand in a standard position, like a 0 degree, and tell me that's a right hand. For body image instead, we refer to a more semantic and conceptual belief of the body. In this case, we can study body image if I ask you to match the representation of your body, the image, the picture that you have of your body in your memory to one of these silhouettes here. So it's a more abstract concept of the body that does not rely as much on sensorimotor integration as the body schema. Then recently, there has been also the free energy principle account to explain body representation. The free energy principle is more like a mathematical concept. And the way it has been explained that we perceive our body, we can keep a sense of awareness and sense of self by predicting continuously some sensory inputs and reducing the prediction error. So basically everything that we do with our body during sensorimotor activation, we need to predict external sensory states, action states, and external states. And when we predict these representation, these states, we compare with the real ones. And only by reducing the prediction error, we can maintain a current body representation. So when we bring all of this concept to the world of spinal cord injury, the main problem that we meet is that spinal cord injury presents sensorimotor loss. So we do believe that the main component of the body representation that's affected after spinal cord injury is the body schema, because it's less abstract and relies on sensorimotor integration. We recently also proposed that the impairment of multisensory integration following spinal cord injury can affect body representation. So multisensory integration is the ability to integrate multiple sensory stimuli. We propose this model by which we believe that spinal cord injury presents some unisensory imbalance, and this can affect the way stimuli are integrated both at the sensory level in sensory specific multisensory areas, but also in non-sensory specific multisensory areas. This can generate an imbalance that can affect the body representation. In this example, we provide evidence that somatosensory stimuli are for sure perceived weak after spinal cord injury, particularly in participants with complete injury. So they do reach somatosensory cortex, but they may not be integrated as good as without an injury, as in healthy controls. So instead, we also propose that auditory information, for example, is stronger in spinal cord injury because there is evidence of a stronger startle reflex, while visual information is less impaired, non-impaired at all, or non-impaired at all. So this imbalance between weakness and dominance can affect the way participants with spinal cord injury integrate stimuli at the sensory or multisensory level. We also propose that top-down modulation can be less impaired or fully functional after spinal cord injury, like selective attention. And we believe that this can be important for modulation or multisensory integration if we ask participants to pay attention to specific stimuli in order to be integrated. We also propose that body image and the free energy principle can be less impaired following spinal cord injury. The first is because this relies less on sensorimotor integration. So it relies more on our memory, on the way we see our body. The second is because the free energy principle may adapt to the new way that the stimuli can be predicted. So this can generate some form of embodiment that are not lost. And this could be the case if you think of phantom sensations in amputees. So the embodiment is preserved in those clinical participants despite the amputation. Here I'm going to provide two examples, so two studies that have been performed in spinal cord injury to investigate both body image and body schema. So in this one, the authors were interested in the body image. They asked the participant with the complete or incomplete injury, both thoracic and cervical injury, to perform a body image task. Basically, participants had to provide a scaled version of themselves to match the stimulus on the screen. They were provided with three different anchors: the head anchor, a right foot, or a left foot. And they had to tap the screen where they thought their body parts would be. The authors calculated the difference between the perceived and the true ratio in order to have a percentage of true ratio in three different dimensions. They calculated this in the torso length relative to the hip width, in the arm length relative to the shoulder width, and in the leg length relative to the hip width. And they found that generally, regardless of the level of lesion, participants with spinal cord injury tended to have an effect of elongation, in particular in the torso. However, they conclude that because they don't find any effect of a level of injury, so they believe that the sensorimotor loss did not affect differently the body image, but their results can be simply driven by the fact that after spinal cord injury, there is a long-term change in the posture, and this can adapt or may alter some body image perceptions. Instead, for a body schema, in this study, participants with both complete and incomplete injury were studied. They were mainly thoracic. We only find for cervical participants with for participants with cervical injury. They asked to perform a body schema task. In particular, it's a laterality judgment task that is known to activate the body schema. As I said before, because you need to activate your sensorimotor system to perform this task. Participants were asked to provide a judgment if the stimulus on the screen was a left or right. They could see a hand or a foot, and this stimulus could be oriented in the 4 different angles: 0 degree, 90, 180, and 270. What is interesting in this study is that they asked the participants to perform this task adopting 2 different postures. They asked participants to perform the laterality judgment events while they had their hands crossed, so basically like this, or to judge the laterality of the feet by crossing their feet. In another blocks, they ask participants to perform the same task, but in anatomical position, so with their hands straight. What they calculate is the difference in the reaction time between crossed and straight. Now, when we cross our hand, it's more difficult for us to perform this task because there is a mismatch between the space-based representation of our own hand compared to the external hand that we see on the screen. So mental rotation takes longer. And this is the pattern that we should be observing in a non-injured population, like in what we should expect. So the difference between these two should be higher. What they find is that for the feet stimuli, participants with complete injury had no modulation of the posture, concluding that they would they performed the task with the same difficulty. So the posture did not have any effect on their reaction time, while incomplete participants behaved as control participants. They do not find any effect with the hands, but that's because I believe they only have for participants with cervical injury. So what we can conclude so far is that sensorimotor deficits in spinal cord injury affect the performance in this laterality judgment task because of a body schema activation. Body imaging state seems to be less impaired. However, behavioral evidence alone is not informative of whether there is a change at the cortical level in the representation of the body following the injury. So we do believe that SCI can alter body representation to sensorimotor loss deficits, but also to cortical remapping. So neural components of body schema activation in SCI to date are still missing. And these are the aims of our study. So we were interested to study body schema activation after spinal cord injury, focusing on focusing on EG correlates and analyzing two aspects of EG, the event-related potential and oscillatory activity of alpha and beta power. We performed an analysis called event-related spectral perturbation. Our hypothesis is that there is an general abnormal processing of body-related information in SCI group. We could see this by reduced amplitude in some components that are specific to the body stimuli processing. And also we could see a reduction in alpha and beta power for the processing of body-related stimuli. So before I present my study, I will go over quickly to the components of body schema activation that are usually investigated in this task. This may facilitate the understanding of our results. So when we perform event-related potentials, we can focus on two main clusters of components. Early components that are mainly sensory. They can still be modulated by higher cognitive function like attention, but they happen usually around 100 to 100 milliseconds. And then we have later components that they usually we can observe them after 300 milliseconds, so later in the time. For early components in this kind of task has been shown the parietal P100 and 200. So a parietal P100 is a positive peak that is seen usually in parietal or occipital areas. It's usually sensitive to any visual processing, but what's interesting is that this has been observed also for the processing of particular stimuli that evoke some embodiment effects or motor affordance. And for motor affordance, I mean any action possibility that the object that we observe evoke, like this object. We can easily grasp it, or like a handle of a mug, we can grasp it, or a handle of a door. So any object that evokes as an action possibility. So it was interesting to see that even these electrodes were not located on motor areas, but parietal, they were still sensitive to this kind of modulation related to the sensorimotor activation. Then we found the negative at 200 particular 190 milliseconds. This is a body selective component. It has been shown to be related to any processing of body stimuli and also biological motion. So as you can see here, we have some electrodes, parietal and parieto-occipital. And you can see that this negative peak is higher for processing of faces, bodies, silhouette, and is less negative for processing of objects, so no body-related stimuli, and scrambled silhouette, which are silhouettes that are not easy to recognize. Another early cluster of components can be the frontocentral N100, the P200. These components are usually related to attentions, silence, and memory effect. But recently also has been seen that it is modulated by sensorimotor effects like affordance as well. So in this task, for example, participants were observing these objects. Those are objects that evoke affordance. And once again, for affordance, I mean action possibilities that objects evoke. These objects were divided in different clusters, for example, high affordance and high attractiveness versus low affordance and low attractiveness. And the authors found that the P200 in the frontal area is higher for objects that they evoke high affordance and high attractiveness. So the P200 has also been considered as an index of facilitated access to the motor or action representation. However, it's important to note that the exact function and the neural source of the P200 is not fully understood today. There is evidence that indicates that the P200 may reflect more like a general neural process that occurs for any stimulus that we observe, that is usually compared with an internal representation or expectation from our memory context. Then in the cluster for later components, high cognitive components, we found, for example, the rotation-related negativity or a late P300. It's basically superimposed negativity on a centroparietal late positivity. So these components become less negative for stimuli that require a high cognitive load. For example, during rotation of letters or also body-related stimuli. So the harder is the rotation, more negative is this component. Like you can see here, the peak to 0 degree compared to 180 degree. So it's a specific component related to mental rotation effect. And that has been shown to be modulated also by stimuli that represent the body. And then finally, for the power of for spectral perturbation measurements, we found usually two frequencies that are related to the activation of the motor system. Those are the well-known alpha and beta band. They synchronize usually for any action that we perform, as well as for motor imagery. So if we imagine to perform a movement, for action observation, if we just observe someone else performing a movement, and also rotation of body stimuli. This is because we internally activate our sensorimotor system to perform the rotation of the stimuli that we observe. So there is lots of evidence on this alpha beta desynchronization. Here I only choose this one because it's close to the study that we perform. So in this task, participants were asked once again to perform a laterality judgment task. What was interesting is that in some blocks, this stimuli could be only sometimes upright, generating some kind of uncertainty or surprise effect for participants, compared to blocks where these stimuli were always upright, so easier to perform. What the author found is that when the stimuli were sometimes upright, generated a higher desynchronization of these two frequencies. So we can finally introduce our study. So we asked our participants to perform a laterality judgment task. This task is known to activate body schema. We focus on event-related potentials, the components that I just introduced, and the oscillatory activity, so the synchronization of alpha beta band. We had 32 participants, 14 participants had the spinal cord injury. They were both cervical and thoracic. They were both complete and incomplete. This is the task that we asked them to perform. So they were presented on the screen with one of these stimuli. There could be a left or right hand, a left or right foot, or a left or right little animal. I would refer in the presentation as object other than animal. They had to tell us as fast as possible if the stimulus that they would observe on the screen was a left or right. The stimuli can be oriented in two rotations, the easy rotation, 75 degrees, and the difficult rotation, 150 degrees. We only choose these two rotations because in EEG we need many trials, and we were not having able to do the standard task with the 4 rotations. So this stimuli could be left or right. They had to provide the response as fast as possible. We recorded the vocal reaction time, EEG activity, and accuracy. Here is an example of a trial. We had 480 trials, so 80 per condition. Each trial started with a variable fixation cross in which participants were instructed to look. After the fixation cross, the stimulus would appear. It could be any of those, randomized. They have a maximum of 5 seconds to provide the left or right response. And then this stimulus was followed by an intertrial interval variable. And after this, the next trial started. We performed this in blocks of 2-3 minutes in order that participants had breaks. For the behavioral part, the results show the SCI are overall slower than controls to perform the task. What was interesting is that they are slower to perform this task for the stimuli that are related to the body, so feet and hands, and not for the object. They're still slower than controls, but they have a modulation for the processing of body stimuli versus no body related stimuli. They also show modulation of accuracy. So basically the harder rotation, 150 degrees, induced the lower percentage of reaction times compared to, the lower percentage of correct responses compared to the easy rotation and also compared to controls. We found the main effect of reaction times that were larger for, so slower for the rotation that was difficult to perform. And this was present in all of our stimuli. And we also found a main effect of accuracy that shows that harder was the rotation, less was the accuracy. In terms of brain data, here I'm going to show the global field power, which is a simple measure of a spatial standard deviation. So it's a spatial standard deviation calculated across all the electrodes. So it's spatially insensitive, but can lead some, it usually is done to precede some temporally focused analysis. And this is mainly done to make sure that we have the time windows in which we're going to see those components. So as I said, we were going to see components around 100 milliseconds, 200 milliseconds, and after 300. In order to do that, we need to make sure that we actually have components. And this is the way we calculated, we performed this analysis. So in both groups, in all conditions, we could observe peaks around those time windows I just explained. Regarding the location, for event-related potentials, we look at the posterior P100 and 200 on this cluster of electrodes bilaterally. So we have the effect of hemisphere also as a factor in our analysis. Then we have the rotation-related negativity bilaterally as well in these electrodes. And then the frontocentral N100, the P200 in these electrodes. Regarding the event-related spectral perturbation, we go to look at the motor cortex, so C3 and C4 electrode, and we also look at the vertex. we calculated the spectral perturbation using wavelets with a 3 cycle for the lowest frequency, which was alpha 8 Hertz, and 15 for the highest, which was 30 for the beta, with a baseline correction of -700 to -300 milliseconds before the onset of the stimulus. So these are our results for the early components. So once again, here we're looking to the P100 and 200, which is related to the processing of visual stimuli that can evoke any embodiment effect, and that relates to body in the case of 200. So we found that SCI participants have reduced P100. So this positive peak after stimulus onset compared to control. This was reduced compared to control. We found an effect of a reduced to N200 for objects compared to hands and feet, congruent with the literature that body-related stimuli show a higher peak, a higher amplitude of the N200. And here below is just to show these effects across the hemisphere, so the left and the right hemisphere in both groups, SCI and controls, for the feet, stimuli, hand, and objects. We do not found a modulation of N200 between groups, although seems almost to be there. I think we lose it because seems not to be sensitive enough in the right hemisphere. Then for the other part of the early potential, so the frontocentral and 100 P200, which again, they are mainly related to attentional resources and access to the motor representation. We find a reduced N100 in SCI participants compared to control, and a higher P200 in SCI participants compared to control. We found a speculative effect like of the N200 but inverted for the P200, which was higher for the feet and hand compared to the object. And here is just to show the whole three kind of stimuli, so the feet, the hands, and the object across participants and condition. And finally, when we look at the late potentials, so for the rotation-related negativity, we find an effect of the hemisphere, which was higher for the left hemisphere, so more negative for the left hemisphere compared to the right. And this is well known in literature that body-related stimuli they are usually processed by the left hemisphere. So has been shown that the left hemisphere is more specific for rotation that engage motor stimulation. So this rotation-related negativity component again is related to mental rotation, and it gets more negative for with the higher complexity of the task. We found that they also LT control have a higher negativity for the stimulus, for the feet stimuli, and for the harder rotation. So for the rotation at 150 degrees compared to 70 degrees, they do not show the same effect in other conditions, while SCI never show modulation of the rotation-related negativity. These are the results for the event-related spectral perturbation. So we have on this part of the screen, the rotation of the hand at 75 degrees, and here 150 degrees. We have LT control subject in this part of the screen, spinal cord injury subject in this part of the screen. This map are the frequency, so the event-related desynchronization. So they go from 8 Hertz to 30 Hertz. And we have this part, of the top part is the C3 electrode. Then we have the CZ electrode in the middle part of the screen. And in the last part of the screen, we have the C4 electrode. This part instead is basically just the comparison between groups. So the significant levels are indicated by the red colored map. So as you can see, the synchronization is expressed as the blue color, so power reduction. We found that SCI mainly in the beta frequency, desynchronized more than control, regardless of the rotation, if it was easy or difficult. There is a trend to desynchronize more in the beta power. While control, they still have desynchronization in the alpha. They also desynchronize a little bit for beta, but they seem to return to baseline after all. While SCI have this overactivation of the motor cortex that seems to desynchronize at all time. Similarly, we found this for the feet stimuli. Same thing here, we have 75 degree, 150 degree. Here the activation map to indicate where this was significant. And we found similar thing, a higher desynchronization in SCI participants compared to control in the 3 electrodes and across these conditions. Instead, when we compared the stimulus that was not body related, this desynchronization is still a little bit higher, but the comparison were not significant. And as you can see, was a little bit less compared to the other desynchronization. Like, for example, look at the feet desynchronization and the non-body related stimulus desynchronization. So what we can conclude first from our behavioral results is that participants with the spinal cord injury have lower reaction times overall and lower accuracy level compared with controls. In particular, they show modulation of body-related versus no body-related stimuli, as their reaction time was lower for body-related stimuli. We found that they exhibit lower amplitudes of the parietal P100 and higher amplitudes of the frontocentral P200. They seem to lose a modulation of the rotation-related negativity for task difficulty, and they show a higher beta desynchronization across body-related stimuli compared with controls. So what all this means? So we found basically hyperactivity in early stimulus processing. So as I said, the P100 peaks for any visual stimulus, but has also been shown to be sensitive to stimuli that evoke any embodiment effect or affordance. So that could be that these effects are less salient in SCI to induce a reduction in the amplitude of the P100, but it's also true that these visual areas are always and are reciprocally connected with motor areas that receive subcortical input. So that may also be the reason why we found this hyperactivity in early stimulus processing, in particular in the P100. Then we found a higher engagement of top-down structure. So we believe that the higher P200 was associated with the higher attentional results, as well as an access to the motor representation excellent. Could be that those stimuli for SCI require the higher attentional engagement. That's why we found a higher P200. Then we found an absence of the rotation-related negativity for complex mental rotation. So spinal cord injury showed this, basically, we believe that they performed the task with the same high effort. So basically both easy and difficult rotation, maybe for them were perceived as being difficult. So the rotation-related negativity, once again, is related to complex stimuli. There can be any stimulus like conceptual operation, response complexity, tasks that require any high cognitive load, incongruent imitation. And so all of these stimuli reduce the amplitude of this rotation-related negativity. But it's also nice to see that this result is congruent with the literature on amputees, because it has been shown already that in amputees there is an absence of the modulation of the rotation-related negativity in a task similar to our task, so during the hand rotation tasks. Finally, we found a higher desynchronization. So again, higher desynchronization indicates reduction in power. They have higher desynchronization in particular for beta, most likely because there is more difficulty for them to perform the task, but it's also important to note that usually during the activation of the motor cortex, the desynchronization is always present. And it's well known that SCI have motor neuron excitability and exaggerated activation of the motor cortex. Indeed has been found already in the SCI population that there is an overall increased the synchronization of alpha beta for movement execution, but as well as during motor imagery. And higher desynchronization has been also associated with the motor neuron stability, like halfway persistent. And it's known that SCI participants have increased motor neuron stability, both in amplitude and persistence. Halfway amplitude and persistence. So what's the message to take home today is that SCI prevents the exchange between afferent and efferent inputs between brain and the body, and this may affect the way the body schema is engaged. I would like to thank you all for the attention, and also our participants, the Pain Lab members, and my mentor, Dr. Widdowson Noga, the Miami Project Acute Paralysis, also the funding opportunity. Thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any question if you have any question or clarification.
Thank you, Roberta. I have a question. So so we see these changes in people. Is there a way to manipulate these changes to be more normalized?
That's an interesting question. I think it depends what part we can normalize. I believe like training may help. They could be either like performing training with the either they're engaging their own body, so becoming more, even passive movement, becoming more aware of the way they perceive the body. I don't know though how sensitive this could be at the brain level, because there is evidence that at behavioral level these effects may improve. And we actually are doing in our study where we stimulate the parietal cortex with the TDCS and with a similar task, we do see, we have a little evidence on that, but we do see that people tend to normalize the reaction times. I don't know if we can see that it's sensitive enough at the brain level, but there is a way to manipulate by doing training or stimulations, like stimulating areas that involve both multisensory integration and body representation.
Okay, thank you.
Any other question?
Well, then I can ask again. What about, so this is now spinal cord injury, but what about those people who have neuropathic pain?
Yeah.
How different might they be from just someone who doesn't have neuropathic pain?
Yeah, so neuropathic pain is a big topic in the field of body representation, regardless of spinal cord injury. So they tend to perceive, the clinical population with neuropathic pain tend to perceive the body parts different, in a different way, different in size, so perceptions difference in temperature. So I do believe these effects may be more impaired in participants that have neuropathic pain. So there could be that we can find these effects also in both the event rate potentials and also in the desynchronization of alpha and beta. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question actually.
Hi, Gregory. Hi.
Hi, really nice talk. I was just wondering, so this body representation, would it be related to other like secondary pathological outcomes of SCI, such as, you know, mental health? And is that one of the reasons that we want to, as Eva said, try to normalize it or treat it in a certain way, or depression or quality of life in that individual?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when we do this task, we keep in consideration some mental health measurements, like can be depression. as well as the state of the body, like obesity and eating disorder like anorexia, they impact this kind of measurement. So, so there is evidence on depression and eating disorder that can affect these measurements. So the way we do is that we check this before, in our case, I don't know other people, but we have a cutoff for the, we perform a BDI, which is a questionnaire for depression, and as well as we take BMI measurements to make sure they are in a standard range, not too low, not too high, to affect these measurements.
Interesting, thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.